Right. Let's get going. So I was in work after having we were having a conversation when we found out that that B-Sides was going to be in the Titanic building this year. And a colleague turns around and says to me, I bet you someone's going to do a talk about the Titanics of security. Yes, that's right. I am doing a talk about the Titanics of security. It's me. And some of you might think that what you see today would be similar to what you might have heard from Brian this morning in the keynote. But hopefully, I've got a more positive outlook on this. It's my first talk, can you tell? So who on earth am I? My name's Jason Halley. I'm a third-year undergrad at Napier doing cybersecurity and forensics. On my year out at the minute, working in threat intelligence at a security company. I am a new guy in InfoSec, first job, still at uni, all that sort of stuff. But I'm jumping in at the deep end, as it were, being at a conference like this. And yes, I'm originally from Northern Ireland, so this is a home conference for me. If you feel like following me on Twitter, it's @SecComet. There'll be a feedback thing going up after there, hopefully. So we all know about the story of the Titanic, when the Titanic sank in 1912 after striking an iceberg on its maiden voyage. It was the deadliest marine disaster to happen in peacetime. To this day, I believe. And the deaths, depending on what source you look at, are anywhere between 15 and 1,600. It was a horrible tragedy, as we know. In fact, the experience downstairs in this building is dedicated to the history and the memory of that tragedy. And it was a tragedy. But we investigated and we discovered why it happened. And here are some of the reasons. Ice warnings that were given to the crew weren't heeded. They decided to plow at full speed straight through the ice field instead of going around it. There was only one lifeboat drill that was carried out in Southampton. The lifeboat numbers at the time on most ships were dependent on the fact that there would be other ships nearby to shuttle those passengers to. The radio officer on a nearby ship, the Californian, was off duty, meaning that they didn't receive the message that the Titanic was in need of help. The lifeboats weren't fully stocked. And there was a belief, as we know, that the revolutionary technology meant that the ship was unsinkable. Does that remind you of anything? So yes, it was a tragedy, and we found out why. But when we found out why, we fixed those problems. After the Titanic sank, we got an international treaty, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. And I'm going to look briefly at chapter 5, which is the only one that applies to all vessels. And most of the decisions put into that were as a result of the Titanic sinking. There must be a lifeboat place for everyone on board. The radio must be manned 24 hours a day, so you're going to have a rotation of people manning it. The crew must take heed of any of those danger warnings that they receive. And the masters of all vessels must offer assistance to any ship in distress. You'll see that with Somali piracy. Even if the pirates ship gets disabled, the navies have to help them. They can't leave them at sea. That may have seemed off topic, but the question I'm asking is, what is the InfoSec equivalent of SOLAS? Where is that requirement that we implement those lessons that we've learned across the entire industry and across the world? I'd argue there isn't. Some of you might be saying to me, well, what about GDPR? GDPR is good legislation. I'm not going to knock it. But the issue being that it only applies where EU citizens are concerned. And you'll all too often find, especially in America, that websites will simply block EU citizens from accessing their website in order to get around the requirement to comply with GDPR, which isn't great because they should be complying with every if good legislation comes out, whether or not you're required to comply with it, you should, because we should all be invested in making security better. But unfortunately, some people prefer the bottom line over everything else. Audience interaction question number 1. Can we prevent every cyber attack? Who thinks we can? Good. Good, yes. Of course we can't. We can't prevent every cyber attack. There are an unknown amount of unknowns that will prevent us from detecting and stopping any attack launched against you or the company that you work for. So we're never going to be able to stop them all, but when they have happened, we can investigate and we can discover why. And sometimes genuinely users can be somewhat at fault, whether it's through having weak passwords or falling for phishing. And that's not exactly great, But they put their trust in us, in security professionals, if you like, when they upload their data to websites and to your system. And if we are supposedly the experts, then we should not be putting all of our trust in them not to fall for phishing or have a weak password. We can advise, we can suggest to people that this is the way you should do it, but we should always take the worst case scenario that people won't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 3 cyber attacks that have happened and establish for you that we can detect what happened. So Ashley Madison, a data breach that happened in 2015, and I know that's going to be a bit controversial, but at the end of the day, regardless of whether you think the service should exist or not, it does exist, it's storing personal information, and therefore they should be doing so in as secure a way as they can, which, as it turns out, they weren't necessarily doing. There was more than 25 gigabytes of user data dating back as far as 2007 that was released to the public, including names, emails, addresses, and credit cards. It was attributed to a group called the Impact Team. Once they'd stolen the data, they actually essentially ransomed Ashley Madison and their parent company, demanding that if the website and the service wasn't shut down, then they would release the data. Ashley Madison didn't do that, and the data got released. The passwords that were stolen were encrypted with bcrypt, a relatively secure way of storing passwords. And in fact, Robert Graham, CEO at Eratasec, said at the time, "We're so used to seeing cleartext and MD5 hashes, it's refreshing to see bcrypt actually being used." We'll come back to this later. Blackmail of individuals whose data was released in this hack continues actually to this day. And on a slightly sadder note, there are reports that there were individuals who were so ashamed once their families discovered that they'd been using the service that they actually took their own lives, which just goes to show that we think that sometimes of cybercrime as being victimless, but it very much isn't. Ashley Madison were investigated by the US Federal Trade Commission, and they were fined $30 million, essentially, for their negligence. So what went wrong with Ashley Madison? Well, for a start, if you'd been using the service and you decided, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't like what they're doing, and you want to delete your account, you have to pay them to do so. You can deactivate your account for free, but if you want to actually get them to remove your data, you have to pay them £15 in the UK, which is it's a non-zero amount of money, and most people aren't going to want to be paying that. And even in the cases where people did hand over that money, and in a lot of those cases, Ashley Madison just did the account deactivation and actually didn't delete those people's data, which with GDPR enforced nowadays would be a big deal. Oh, what's going on there? Another big problem was the fact that there was no email verification when you were creating an account. If you put in, john@smith.com as your email address when signing up, it would accept that. And not only that, even if you did put in a real email address, there was no requirement to confirm that you own that address before setting up your account. So I could set up an account in the name of anybody in this room if I felt like it. And then you would have to, not only, if you wanted your data to then be removed, you would have to get into that account that I've created and then pay to delete it. And as we've seen, even then, they may not actually delete your data. And you have to ask yourself, if that was you, and your data, your name and your email address ended up being in the list of data that was compromised, would anyone close to you actually believe that it wasn't your account? I don't think they would. We generally accept that if your email's on it, it's your account. And then there's the fact that users, and I said we're not trying to blame users entirely, which we're not, but users were using the same sort of weak passwords as on other websites, except for number 9 on that list, which I'm not going to read out. And I said we'd come back to this because if those passwords had been encrypted with bcrypt, it still would have been very difficult to reverse them to get your password back. But as it turns out, when Ashley Madison had moved from using MD5 to using bcrypt, their MD5 hashing and storage remained active. So MD5 hashes of people's passwords were being stored right alongside the bcrypt hash, meaning, and obviously with these then weaker passwords, that's a lot easier for the attacker to compromise that password. And okay, you may have all their user data anyway, but users tend to reuse passwords between different services, so they're likely going to then start using your email and that cracked password against every website they can find to see if you've been involved. So all in all, not a great day for users of Ashley Madison. Let's move on and look at a WannaCry from 2017. Ransomware, as I'm sure you know, that encrypted your files and demanded payment in Bitcoin, which used two exploits, Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar, which were developed by the NSA, who didn't inform Microsoft that they had these vulnerabilities, and then were eventually leaked stolen, depending on who you want to believe. An estimated 200,000 computers in over 150 countries were affected. So it's clear at this point that attackers don't care about international borders or jurisdictions. They're just going to attack you wherever you happen to be. It was attributed to a group called the Lazarus Group, who are believed to have originated from North Korea. And it wasn't only individuals that were affected, but some rather large businesses. The NHS in the UK was affected. The Nissan production plant in Sunderland actually had to stop production for a time because all their computers were having their data encrypted and not being able to work properly. And even the German National Railway, Deutsche Bahn, their services were affected when they were hit. There was a kill switch in the initial version of WannaCry, discovered by Marcus Hutchins, but eventually there were different kill switches that were implemented in newer variants that were discovered and registered, and then that kill switch was being used, and then eventually a variant was released that just didn't bother with kill switches at all. You could argue that WannaCry wasn't very effective because the ransoms that were paid only totaled around $100,000, whereas the economic impact was up to $4 billion. So it depends how the enemy was, how the attacker wanted to affect us, whether it was through economic impact or through actually making money. Arguably, they succeeded better in causing economic impact than making their own money. So one of the big issues with WannaCry is the NSA. The NSA were developing exploits in-house, finding vulnerabilities in the Windows operating system, developing an exploit for it, not telling Microsoft about it because they didn't want it to be patched. They wanted a chance to use those, and who knows who they were trying to use them against, and arguably, they shouldn't have been doing that. But Microsoft did eventually discover those vulnerabilities on their own and release patches. But as usual, a lot of organizations were either using operating systems that were at end of life, or they weren't updating their systems because they were too worried about breaking core functionality. And that could be the case with feature updates sometimes. Anyone who uses Windows 10 will know that. You update and everything's broken, or all your files are gone. And it's not a fun time. But with security updates, you would like to hope that people would be more responsive, although it isn't always the case. The kill switches were found and registered, which is really a case of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, because you either don't register the kill switch and it doesn't do anything, or you register the kill switch and the hackers just go and change the kill switch, or eventually just remove the kill switch entirely. So now you have no way to stop it. But you would also have no way to stop it if you chose not to register your kill switch. So that really is a case of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. There isn't no win in that situation. And some people didn't keep data backups. They weren't keeping backups of their critical data. So if they were hit with WannaCry and their data was encrypted, their data was genuinely at risk. Whereas if you got backups, you just re-image from your backup. Job done, and you're back up and running. Another issue is that people actually paid the ransom that was being demanded, which if you ask anyone who works in law enforcement, they'll generally tell you that in a ransom situation, paying it is sometimes the worst thing that you can do. When you're demanding payment in Bitcoin particularly, there's no way to track where that money is going to, so there's no chance of you identifying who's who's to blame or getting your money back. You could easily be targeted again. You could pay the ransom. Say, for example, your files actually get decrypted, which there's no guarantee, and then you go connect to a network, and the computer spreads WannaCry back to you, and then you're in the same situation again. And you're marking yourself essentially as vulnerable or willing to compromise. If I blackmail this person for money, that they're going to pay up, and you open yourself up potentially to further attacks. There were actually people after WannaCry were sending out emails to as many addresses as they could find, saying, "I am the creator of WannaCry. If you do not give me money, I will delete all your files this time, and you will never get them back." Who knows if they were actually those individuals or not? So ransomware is no different to any other physical ransom situation. You should under no circumstances pay up. Let's move on to Equifax in 2017, a data breach of 146 million records. That's basically half of the US population, which is a lot of people. And not only that, but the data leaked was critical. If you know anyone in America, they have the social security number, which has no security features built in. And with just name, birth date, and social security number, you can do a lot. You can get credit in someone's name. You could get medical treatment under their name and take their records. You could steal their benefits or their tax refunds from the IRS. And you could commit crimes and mix up criminal records, which could be very difficult to fix afterwards. Equifax came about from essentially just individuals scanning the web and saying, "Oh, we know there's a vulnerability. Let's scan the web to see if we can find any servers that are vulnerable to it." And they did. They found 3 that belonged to Equifax, and were able to get the credentials to these servers, which were promptly then used against every other Equifax-owned server they could find. And it worked for another 48 servers. So clearly credential reuse was involved here. And arguably these hackers were smart, because they exfiltrated their data slowly, knowing that if they tried to bring it out all in one big lump, they were almost certain to be detected and potentially stopped. But by doing it more slowly, they bought themselves time to get all the data out without being detected. So updates are rearing their ugly head again when it comes to Equifax. The vulnerability that was used had a patch released by Apache on March 8th, 2017, and the attack didn't start till March 10th. You might say, well, that's not very long, and if you had a large amount of servers like Equifax do to update, you might not get round to getting them all done in time. But when it comes to Equifax, they only had to update those 3, and the attack may have been stopped in its entirety. Password reuse was also a problem. Like I said, the hackers only got the credentials for 3 servers, but these ended up being valid for another 48 servers. We can all do maths, and that's 51 servers in total that they got access to, only from compromising 3 directly. If Equifax had been using unique credentials and passwords for every server that they had, then the data stolen may have only been the data from those 3 servers rather than the 48 others. A lot of people never gave their data to Equifax. As a credit monitoring firm, they buy data from God knows how many different sources, and then it's all stored there, and you may not know that they've ever obtained your data, which isn't great. And in fact, in the EU, arguably, it's unlawful now, because you need individuals to opt into their data being collected by third parties before you can actually do so lawfully. When Equifax discovered that they'd been hacked, there was a period of about 6 weeks where they kept it to themselves. They didn't release that information publicly, which is not a good idea when those individuals affected, their data was already in the wild. And excuse me. They were hiding essentially the fact that they had been breached, rather than allowing those people to fix or to at least know that their data may be out there, and to look for suspicious activity. And arguably, this was done to give Equifax executives time to sell their stocks, because they knew that as soon as the news of the attack went, their stock would just go through the floor. Although they claim it was time that they used to conduct an investigation. Arguably, both are true. The website that they then set up to tell individuals if they've been affected, because remember, not everyone whose data was in that breach actually gave it to Equifax in the first place, was poor. Not only was the web address they used sounded like a phishing account, an actual phishing website with a similar name but with the word swap round was set up, and the official Equifax Twitter started tweeting about that. So essentially, Equifax were promoting phishing against their own data subjects. And not only that, but the system itself was poorly constructed. Depending on what device you used or what browser you used, or even just randomly from check to check, it would change its mind between you've been involved, you've not been involved, which isn't great. So we've established that we can always investigate after these attacks happen, and we can determine, for the most part, the reasons why they happened, the causes, and what we could have done in hindsight, which is of course 2020, that we could have done, and if we had done, would have prevented or minimized the effect of those attacks that happened. So if we can do that, why do similar attacks still happen? Why do we see companies hashing passwords with MD5, reusing credentials, not updating their servers when security vulnerabilities come out? Arguably, it's because that point of view that we have, where we're all in our own little box and we don't want to share anything because we're afraid of either letting out intellectual property or afraid that we are going to embarrass ourselves either to the customers of your organization or to rival organizations. And despite the fact that these individuals still, despite the fact that they don't share, and it leads to this issue of hiding ourselves away rather than sharing and trying to make security better for everyone. And those really are two different cultures, the blame culture and the just culture. And at the minute, in security, the vast majority of organizations are in this blame culture, where they're focused on concealing their mistakes or blaming those mistakes entirely on one individual and saying, it's your fault, you're fired, get rid of that person, we fixed the problem. Well, probably haven't. It's in a blame culture, you're going to be more focused on protecting the bottom line rather than protecting your data. And it does lead to this security theater, an illusion that you've got effective security when, if you look deep, if you ask yourself honestly, there are going to be holes in your security. There are going to be ways in. But you pretend, oh yes, we're a bastion. No one's getting into our system. And if you're pretending like that's the case, someone's probably already in your system. What we should be doing is we should be focusing more on shipping and aviation and having this just culture of saying, okay, we messed up. What could we have done? Let's implement that. And arguably, let's then share that to the world and say, look, we have made a mistake, but we know how to stop this mistake happening for everyone. Here is how to do it. You install this patch, you stop doing this, or you stop hashing your passwords with MD5. Arguably, that's an obvious lesson, but I keep coming back to it as an example. And that will lead over time to a sharing of security best practice among everyone, where, because everyone is sharing, none of us are particularly shamed or embarrassed to say, look, I made a mistake. Or we made a mistake, rather, as an organization. But we're fixing it just like every other organization is doing. And here is some information on how you could prevent this happening to yourselves in the future. Rather than the minute where if an organization gets compromised, all their rivals just go, ha ha ha, they got hacked. Which is not the ideal solution, because likely if they've already been compromised in a particular manner, that attacker is coming after everyone in that business area. And as I mentioned, and as you would have heard from Brian this morning, that's used more commonly in aviation and indeed also in shipping. which is hopefully gives reason to my lecturing on the Titanic earlier. By the way, go downstairs if you want more on the Titanic. You won't get that much from me. But other industries have learned this already. They like shipping and aviation and others. They've learned that it's better to say, okay, we made a mistake. We have found out exactly what happened, and then tell everyone, here is how you stop this from happening ever again. And for resulting in the most part, you don't see the same shipping disaster or the same aviation disaster happening more than once, ideally, or certainly no more than a couple of times. We don't hear of aircraft running out of fuel constantly. We don't hear of ships hitting icebergs down the side and destroying all their watertight compartments happening every time. So I guess what I'm saying is that we should move to this just culture. And in some ways, some parts of cybersecurity are already doing this. A lot of organizations are putting security.txt information on their websites, where if you know of a problem in that organization, a security issue, you go to their website /security.txt, and there's all the information you need to contact them and report that. Rather than hiding themselves away and going, we're not telling you anything, we're a bastion, we're invulnerable. They're saying, okay, we might be vulnerable. If we are, please tell us, we want to know. And bug bounties are another good way of doing that, and offering a financial reward through doing it. Now, we're not going to solve every problem just with a text file or with bug bounties, but already in the UK, at least, we have the National Cybersecurity Centre, who will get involved with liaising with organisations who are either in the middle of an attack or whether an attack has happened, to help them in whatever way they can. And they can glean bits of information from that can then be anonymized and shared with other organizations. And arguably, this is the way aviation works as well. Each country having its own organization that deals with the aftermath, the discovering why or how, and then sharing that. Although arguably there's less anonymizing of the data there, because you can't really conceal the fact that your ship sank or your plane crashed. But we could do more. We're not perfect at all. And in fact, what we ideally need, or what I think we ideally need, is some sort of equivalent of SOLAS, a global requirement to implement the lessons that we've learned from previous attacks, so we don't see them happening again. We need that global essentially legislation, a convention, whatever you want to call it, to say that, yes, in our country, when we find out this has happened, we find out that there's a particular way that organization can be attacked, we are going to require every organization that does business in our country to fix it. And you might think, I'm dreaming, but well, if we're dreaming, then the sky is the limit, and I'd say we should be aiming, as usual, for the best possible security that we can. I would love to, if they decide to have me back, to be back at B-Sides Belfast in 5 years' time, saying, you know what, guys, we've done it. We found an equivalent of SOLAS for cybersecurity, and it's implemented across most of the world. And that would be great. I'd be happy to see that, and I hope you would too. So essentially what I'm saying is that within the future, I want to be able to say that, you know what, security within just about every organization is built from disaster. And on that hopefully positive forward-looking thought, I think, we're coming to the end of the time. So that's all. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. We will hope to see you back in 5 years, right?
I'd like to be back in 5 years.
Any questions? Come on, people. We have some time. You were very, very clear. Oh.
Sorry, tell us about SOLAS. Is that to do with ships, isn't it?
Yes, so it's an international convention for safety of life at sea, as it's called. I think so 99% of shipping by tonnage is registered to a nation that has agreed to it. and it sets out safety standards that are mostly come from lessons learned in tragedies. And if you register your ship, say in the UK, which is a nation that has signed up to SOLAS, there are these minimum standards of safety that you must adhere to, which would ideally lead to. So it would mean that the incidents and the tragedies that have happened in the past would hopefully not occur in the future.
Also, a device attached to the ship recently. I was reading that pen test partners found a box attached to a ship's network, and that no one knew what it was, but they worked out eventually what it was. The owners didn't know what it was. There was no inventory mentioned for it. I mean, is it that good, SOLAS?
So SOLAS is focused more on safety rather than cybersecurity. You could argue that global InfoSec equivalent of cybersecurity that I would ideally like to see would be what would prevent that sort of cyber incident from happening.
Right. Another question? Yep.
So I work in an industry in which most of our revenue comes from maritime customers, and we do specifically connectivity for the maritime sector and aviation as well. And yes, as our lovely speaker said, a lot of those regulations are based mostly around safety. And my particular company, not to put in a plug, but we are looking to increase our security at the edge, so that way the connectivity that goes through to ships, and not just for safety purposes, but also for just end user connectivity for crew members or for the business capabilities. There's a lot of research and funding and development going into that because there are vulnerabilities there, and that's something that is definitely in need of being addressed and is being addressed, if that helps any. Cheers.
Any more? Yep. Next time you sit somewhere up front. It's easy.
Thanks. So one of the big drivers for adopting aviation safety standards was the use of shared resources like airports. You weren't allowed to, an airline wasn't allowed to use an airport unless it was signed up to the standard. Do you think there's any equivalent for IT and so on that we could use to drive something like those standards?
Arguably, the cloud could be that requirement. You know, Google Cloud or Azure or AWS could be game changers and drive forward this by introducing a standard of security within your organization and say, hey, if you want to use our service, you have to comply with this standard, and if you don't, well, then our doors are closed to you.
All right. Any more? No? Okay, we have a short lunch break. Coffee break. And we will be back here at 11:45 for the next speaker. And thank you again, Jason. Give him a hand.
Thanks, guys.